we are very honored to introduce our first keynote speaker, Dr. Kathleen Heugh. She is currently Associate Professor in Applied Linguistic Research Center for Languages and Cultures, University of South Australia. Together with her is Megat Mohamed Amin Megat Mohamed Noor, the Secretary of Inisiatif Pengislahan Pendidikan Nasional, being the moderator. Welcome, Dr. Kathleen, and welcome, Ustaz Amin. Yes, welcome. And Ustaz Amin, the floor is yours now.
Yes, thank you, Kayan. We shall now begin with the first keynote address. Yang berbahagia Dr. Tan Hussein, Chairperson Organizing Committee, also Chairman of Inisiatif Pengislahan Pendidikan Nasional IPPN, the National Education Reform Initiative. Dr. Kathleen Heugh, first keynote speaker, esteemed invited speakers, distinguished guests, members of the organizing team, ladies and gentlemen. Selamat datang, selamat pagi, good morning here in Malaysia. Selamat petang, selamat malam, good evening, wherever you may be at this moment in time. On behalf of the organizers, IPPN and Dongzong, I wish to welcome all of you to the International Conference on Mother Tongue-Based Multilingual Education 2021. Thank you everyone for your inspiring support. We will now introduce more about our first keynote speaker. She is Dr. Kathleen Heugh, an Associate Professor in Applied Linguistics, Research Center for Languages and Cultures, University of South Australia. Associate Professor Kathleen Heugh is a social applied linguist who specializes in language policy and planning, bilingual and multilingual education, and English medium instruction. She teaches social linguistics and coordinates University of South Australia's English additional language major, in which she has embedded contemporary translanguaging and transknowledging pedagogy and research. Kathleen works with several large transnational organizations, including various agencies of the United Nations, the European Union, and the African Union, transnational bodies such as the British Council, international policy think tanks located in Africa, Central, South, and East Asia. Kathleen has specialist and expertise in system-wide and multi-country evaluation studies on languages and literacy in education in sub-Saharan Africa for international governments and development agencies, including UNESCO and UNDP. Kathleen holds several honorary positions, including the University of Western Cape and Human Sciences Research Council in South Africa, and the National Multilingual Education Resource Center, Jawaharlal Nehru University, Delhi. Kathleen has designed and taught at master's degree and postgraduate diploma levels in language policy and planning, and bilingual and multilingual education at universities of Cape Town and Antwerp. A very gracious mission welcome to you, Dr. Kathleen Heugh. It is our pleasure. Thank you very much for being able to be with us. The title of the talk given to our speaker is Mother Tongue-Based Multilingual Education, Context, Theories, and Practices. Without further ado, let us welcome Dr. Kathleen Heugh with a keynote address. Dr. Kathleen, the session now is yours.
Thank you very much for the very kind words, and thank you very much for the introductions, but also for the invitation to be with you today. I'm very honored to be here. So I'm going to go to my presentation. Please let me know if you can see the screen.
Yes, you can see us. Thank you.
So as been introduced already, I'm going to be speaking about mother tongue-based multilingual education. I'm going to be talking about the origins of the term, the context in which it has been used, and how it has traveled through Southeast Asia and also in South Asia. To begin with, I'll just offer a brief outline of the presentation. I'll be focusing on the terminology that we use for mother tongue-based multilingual education, its origins in South Africa, its link to a sub-Saharan Africa longitudinal study that involved 25 countries. I'll also be referring to many misperceptions, misunderstandings, myths and false claims about the use of the term and the process of multilingual education. I'll also be referring to the fact that nothing stands still in time. We learn from our mistakes, we learn from our successes, and we also learn from one another in terms of conversations that travel particularly across post-colonial countries of the global South. So in a sense, I'll also be referring obliquely to the process of coloniality and our travels through post-coloniality towards a situation of decoloniality. I'll be referring to theory from the South, the global South, Southern epistemologies also. I'll be referring to aspects of multilingualism, including code switching, translanguaging, and something that we now realize needs to accompany all of our discussions on multilingualism, and that is, it's not just about language, it's about knowledge. It's not just about translanguaging, it's also about transknowledging. And then looking ahead to what we might be able to do together in communalities of care, hope, and love. So to introduce the paper, I'll clarify some of the basics. I'll be looking at terminology, the context, and globalization and diversity. We know that multilingualism and multilingual education are not new. Understanding of multilingualism and multilingual education differs between those who are located in the global South and those who are located in the global North. In other words, multilingualism is not the same in one setting as it is in another. So multilingualism, as it is experienced in Malaysia, for example, will not be the same as it is experienced, say, in India or in South Africa, or, for example, in Brazil, in South America. So we also realize then that multilingualism and multilingual education differs in the global South. It's not as if there's one set of views of multilingualism that are understood and used in the global North and another set that are used in the global South. There are differences even in the global South between how we experience multilingualism. So if we think about globalization and diversity, we used to think that globalization was going to result in a reduction of linguistic diversity. Well, we now know that that is not the case. Globalization, in fact, is resulting in increased linguistic diversity in more parts of the world than ever before. So globalization also doesn't only mean one international language in each context. Certainly there is usually space for an international language or as the Deputy Minister mentioned, the need for a language which is regarded as a lingua franca or the language of wider communication. So instead of globalization, we realize we're looking at increased diversity, that multilingualism is apparently intensifying in the global North, and that there are different kinds of multilingualism in the global South. So how people understand multilingualism is not going to be the same if you are located in London or Birmingham or Manchester or New York. It will not be understood in those different settings, and their understandings in those cities, those huge, enormous cities in Europe, will not be the way or similar to the way multilingualism is understood in cities in the global South. So the vocabulary that we use takes on different meanings in one context from another. So if we refer to multilingualism, we don't mean the same thing, even if we're using the same term. So we need to be careful of inappropriate or incorrect interpretations of the terminology. And we also need to be very careful that we don't have incorrect historical accounts of linguistic diversity in the global South. Sometimes global authors in the global North may not understand the complex historical and geographic ecologies of language in the global South. Yep. So we need to be mindful of an over-reliance on global North understanding of multilingualism, and that it might get us into trouble, and that also it may continue cycles of coloniality or post-colonialism. Now, there are different understandings of the use, and we'll look at these in a little bit more detail. So in the global South, historically, the global South is home to about 96% of the world's languages. 55% of the world's languages are in the Asia Pacific. And if we take Africa into account, 86% of the world's languages are in Africa and Asia Pacific. European colonization introduced the idea of creating a state, followed by national unity or national identity in its former colonies. So we have a situation where in the former colonies of Europe, the emergence of state nations followed by the attempt to invisibilize multilingualism. Figurative meanings for terms such as mother tongue. In Africa, people have different interpretations depending on whether they view this through English as mother language, or whether they view this through French as langue maternelle, or whether they view this through Portuguese, língua materna. Now, each of these terms look as if they are very similar and that they have exactly the same meanings, but in actual fact, the interpretations are significantly different. So even with one term across 3 languages, people understand slightly different things about the use of the mother language, the mother tongue. So what we also need to understand that in most global South settings, despite the policies that might be in place in schools, in national education policies, all education practice is de facto bilingual or multilingual. It cannot be anything other. The students come into the classrooms with different languages. The language of the classroom might be different from that of the students. But the fact that the students are working with languages that they bring into the classroom, the teacher is working with languages that he or she brings into the classroom, and there may be a language of the classroom or the school or the government policy, means that de facto we are looking at bilingual and multilingual education. So even if the term bilingual education or multilingual education is hidden, or it is regarded as deviant from policy, it is nevertheless present in the classroom. The history of the term mother tongue, certainly in many of the former post-colonial countries that I have been in, is usually interpreted in a figurative way. It doesn't literally mean the tongue of the mother. It is seen as the language of the home, that the mother is the person who brought the child into the world, and so it is the language of the home and the mother and the community. So the term mother tongue-based bilingual or multilingual education in many ways is a figurative term, and it revalues or acknowledges the local and regional educational expertise that teachers have, that children have. It acknowledges the interventions and the practices that all good teachers use inside the classroom in order to ensure that children understand what is happening in the schooling context. However, there are different understandings of the use of terminology between the global south and the global north. So in the global north, we know that particularly during the 18th and 19th century, the sense of national identity became more stronger and stronger. And through that emerged the concept of the nation state. So in other words, the sense of the national identity came before the forging of the state. So what happened there was the establishment of the idea that each separate nation state should have one national language. And so in the process of that happening, multilingualism became invisibilized in the global north until the late 20th century. Now, the interpretation of mother tongue in the global north is much more literal. People think about it in a very literal way, and it has taken on a negative meanings, but particularly through the 21st century and discourses related to gender. So we need to be careful or cautious of accepting models from northern contexts and linguistic ecologies that may not work in post-colonial or southern contexts and southern multilingual ecologies. So because we come from different parts of the world, we can't assume that when we use the terminology that we mean the same thing or that the terminology itself represents similar meanings. Now, what led to the term mother tongue-based multilingual or bilingual education in the African context? Well, it really followed 120 years of reports and recommendations for language and literacy education. So this is 120 years before the year 2000, because the year 2000 was actually when the term started to be used in Southern Africa. It came as a result of the use of local languages or the mother tongue for the first 1 to 3 years, and then a switch to the use of English or French or Portuguese medium in sub-Saharan Africa. And it had been recommended in several reports prior to 1953, but it became cemented in the sort of ideas about how one should be providing equitable, human rights-based education for all children on the continent through a UNESCO report in 1953 called The Use of the Vernacular Languages in Education. And this report reaffirmed the idea that it was best for all education to begin in the mother tongue and to continue for the first 1 to 3 years before the switch over to one of the former colonial languages or the international language. But after the independence of each of the countries in Africa, each of the state nations, between the 1960s and the 1990s, what happened was, instead of advancing the use of the vernacular languages, most Anglophone countries, in other words, those countries that had been formerly colonized by Britain, started to reduce the number of years in which mother tongue education had been implemented, even during the colonial years. So in the former Anglophone countries of Africa, mother tongue education had been the medium of instruction for between 4 to 6 years of primary schooling, followed by transition to English medium. Now, in the former Francophone and Lusophone countries, I'm not sure if people are familiar with the term Lusophone, but we refer to that in relation to those countries that had been colonized by Portugal in Africa. In those countries, there was no prior history of mother tongue education. The missionaries and the colonial governments had gone straight for French and Portuguese, and so very little mother tongue education had existed prior to independence. Together, between the 1960s and the 1990s, across Africa, we found very low retention of children in schools, particularly in primary school, very high repeater rates, very poor achievement, and low throughput to secondary school. So pretty much by the late 1990s and the year 2000, fewer than 50% of children actually made it to the end of primary school, and a very small percentage of children made it into secondary school. And of those, a tiny percentage of students made it into higher education. Sorry?
Please proceed. Small interaction. Proceed.
Did someone want to ask me something?
No. There's a small interruption. Please proceed. Thank you.
So coming back to South Africa specifically, South Africa had gone down a different route. People may be familiar with the term apartheid, which meant separate and unequal development, and was a system that was put in place between 1948 and 1994. Now, when the apartheid government came into being, it conducted a research activity in relation to language in education. And it happened to finalize a report at the same time that UNESCO produced its 1953 report, supporting the use of the mother tongue for 1 to 3 years. Now, the South African report decided that, in fact, it would be important for all children to have mother tongue medium for 8 years. 8 years plus, there was an expectation that all children in South Africa would have to become bilingual in English and Afrikaans. Now, this meant for African language speaking children that they had to be trilingual. They would have mother tongue medium for 8 years, and they would also have to develop high-level proficiency in English and Afrikaans. So in other words, for African language-speaking children, they were expected to be trilingual. For white and so-called colored children or mixed-race children, they were expected to be bilingual in Afrikaans and English. This was inequitable because for the vast majority of children, they were expected to be trilingual and the others only bilingual. Now, what was happening elsewhere in Africa at the time was that there was this sort of sense of urgency to access the international language. So in other Anglophone countries, as I mentioned before, mother tongue medium, a sort of an urgent move towards English medium instruction as early as possible. This had already been the case in those countries that had been colonized by France and Portugal. And so elsewhere in Africa, African language speaking children had at most 1 to 3 years of mother tongue and then transitioned to English, French, or Portuguese. So parents, African language speaking parents in South Africa wanted the same. They did not like 8 years of mother tongue medium, and so political resistance occurred by 1996, and this resulted in a reduction of the use of 8 years of mother tongue to 4 years of mother tongue education and very rapid transition to English medium education. What we have seen since that point in 1976, and a little flow through for another couple of years as children in high school had still benefited from 8 years of mother tongue, was that there was resistance to the inequality of apartheid, there was resistance to the term mother tongue, and there was resistance to the term bilingual education. And all of these had negative connotations. While this resistance was emerging, very few people noticed that the students who had 8 years of mother tongue medium plus English plus Afrikaans developed high-level achievement, the highest level of achievement in our education system to date, between the years 1953 and effectively 1978. So especially with 8 years of mother tongue for African language speaking students, plus Afrikaans and English, we had the highest rate of successful secondary school completions and student achievement and entry into higher education. After 1976 and the reduction to 4 years of mother tongue education, student achievement and completion of secondary school declined dramatically. It further declined after the end of apartheid in 1994, when the use of the mother tongue was reduced even further to a maximum of 3 years, followed by a switch to EMI. Now that sort of decline in successful completion of primary and secondary school has continued over the last 26 years at this point. So the history of the term continued. The post-apartheid language and education policy in 1997 was informed by multilingual education research findings between 1930 and 1995. We borrowed the term at the time additive and subtractive bilingual education from North America and Europe because in the context, the political context of South Africa, we had to try to get away from mother tongue based bilingual education. So it was seen as preferable to mother tongue at that point. So we use the term additive multilingual education and we changed the term mother tongue to home language. So it was really home language, meaning mother tongue or local language as the foundation for learning, with additional languages, usually the additional language being English. So bilingual education was explained in the new policy as bilingual education based on home languages and English, with a minimum of 2 languages for each child. Or additive multilingual education was explained as multilingual education based on the home language and English, because there were different mother tongues across the country. So everyone would use their different mother tongue. So that would have to mean a multilingual education policy plus English. So multilingual education meant at least the mother tongue plus English, but where possible, also a 3rd and even 4th language for each student. Now, debates between stakeholders and attempts to clarify the policy of additive and bilingual education were taken up by the Project for the Study of Alternative Education, which is based at the University of Cape Town. And eventually it was decided to adapt the term and return from the use of the word or the term home language to mother tongue, simply because most people actually understood the term mother tongue better than the term home language, and to avoid confusion with the European and North American models of bilingual education. So bilingual education based on the home language and English was returned to mother tongue based bilingual education with a minimum of two languages for each student, and then multilingual education based on the home language and English was changed around to mother tongue based multilingual education for system-wide bilingual and trilingual education for each student. So the principles here were that the new terminology was intended to clarify historical and political misunderstandings in the South African context. It was never intended to travel to other contexts. So we were very surprised to see that the terminology was picked up, for example, in Southeast Asia and South Asia. The original intention may have been understood, and it may very well have been interpreted differently elsewhere. So what do we know from mother tongue based bilingual or multilingual education from research in Africa? Going back to the 1930s and 40s, we know that students in bilingual medium education achieve higher in its school exit examinations. They are less likely to engage in ethno-linguistic conflict and more likely to coexist peacefully. So in other words, these are students who are in schools where they learn both through, they learn through 2 languages simultaneously. In Nigeria in the 1970s, there was a really excellent project called the 6-year primary project between 1970 and 1976. And it involved the use of 6 years of mother tongue medium, followed by a switch to English medium instruction with well-trained teachers and good provision of appropriate textbooks. Now, you'll remember that I mentioned that elsewhere in Africa after the 1960s, most countries adopted an approach of a maximum of 3 years of mother tongue followed by transition to English. But it wasn't working in Nigeria, which is why the scholars in Nigeria decided to try for 6 years of mother tongue medium and to see what would happen by a delayed transition to English after the 6th year. Of course, English was taught as a subject all the way through primary school. So the students did have very good teaching and learning of English as a subject for 6 years before they were expected to change over to EMI in the 7th year of school. And that worked really, really well. And we found that students in those schools outperformed students in schools where they had 3 years of mother tongue medium, followed by a switch to English. And they outperformed those students in English language proficiency at the end of year 6 and all the way through high school. And they outperformed the students in the 3-year mother tongue programs all the way through secondary school across the curriculum. We also know from a number of studies between the 1980s and 1921 across sub-Saharan Africa that we can see the failure of early exit bilingual programs, early exit from the mother tongue, and early transition to either English medium instruction, French medium instruction, or Portuguese medium of instruction. So we've got countless studies which show the failure of these programs. In summary, the research across Africa between 1930 and 21 confirms that students remain in school for more years in primary with mother tongue education plus the international language. In other words, mother tongue-based bilingual education for each child. The longer the use of the mother tongue education medium, the higher is the student achievement. We know that 3 years of mother tongue is better than no years of mother tongue. 4 years increases opportunities, but not enough to sustain lifelong literacy. 6 years increases opportunities to sustain literacy and to reach secondary school. 8 years offers best chances to reach the end of secondary school successfully. Children can learn to read and write in 2 orthographies and 3 languages better than 1 or 2 languages. And we found also that 3 languages may be more beneficial than 2 languages for students in school. So there are a number of myths and things that we need to avoid in relation to the way people think about mother tongue-based bilingual education and mother tongue-based multilingual education. The first is that there are a number of false claims, and we have a reality check for each of these. The first of the false claims is that the mother tongue term is outdated and it's not valid. There's a claim that people don't know what their mother tongue is, that they mix languages and therefore just provide that, which is an excuse to persuade governments to provide only the international language. The reality is that mother tongue or mother language is used, the term is used across Africa, Southeast Asia, and South Asia. If people and communities use the term widely, then the term has validity. The language that children use, whether this is a standard language, a variety, a dialect, or a mixing of languages, sometimes known as code mixing or translanguaging, the language may be one used by the father, the mother, family members. It may be different languages. It is the language that is used in the home that is the mother tongue. In other words, it doesn't have to be a specific language. It can be the language use in the home. So it is used as a metaphorical term. The false claim based on a literal meaning of the mother tongue suggests that this discriminates against men or transgender people. So this is a claim that has emerged over the last 20, 25 years or so. The claim is that the mother tongue-based bilingual education does not offer students adequate access to the international language. Well, as I've said before, in the global south, people use the term figuratively, not literally. Bilingual and multilingual education always offers access to the international language, but some approaches to this are better than others. So there's confusion of meaning. Some critics misunderstand the terms or they misuse them, and this causes confusion for parents, teachers, and educational officials. What we need to emphasize then is that mother tongue-based bilingual education or multilingual education offers the best approach we know, and it is supported by considerable and reliable evidence. This is not to say it's the only approach. It is simply that it's the best approach that we understand and that we can find evidence to support. So how do we understand multilingualism in education then? So in the global north, there are these debates that apparently emerge from monolingual nation-state ideologies. And these are dominant discourses about languages. The theory of bilingual education in the global north is often misunderstood as two separate systems. And there is an argument that the practices, of course, are more complex. And it gives a rise to a more northern misunderstanding of multilingual education as limited only to a small subset of European or North American bilingual models of bilingual education. And the pedagogy that is used in these models of bilingual education has moved from using direct method to communicative language teaching, in which very often there is a separation of languages, and very often there's a very distinct difference between the majority language and also the minority languages. Oops, sorry. In the global south, people have always understood that multilingualism has at least two dimensions. There's the horizontal dimension. This is the dimension where people mix their languages in order to be able to communicate when they are in settings where people speak several languages. So we know how to use our multilingualism in an informal, horizontal, convivial, communal sense in order to get by, in order to succeed, in order to undertake our daily activities. We also know that we sometimes separate our languages for particular purposes. So we have both the horizontal and the vertical dimensions of languages. So we know, for example, that sometimes a particular language is used in the to observe faith, for instance, Islam. So Arabic may well be used in circumstances where people are engaged in activities of practicing their faith. On the other hand, they might go to the market, and it might be much more useful to be able to use languages that exist in the community for everyday activities. We know that in order to ensure that students move through primary school, secondary school, and have equitable and equal access to higher education, they will need to have access to academic language use, which requires a separation of languages. So most people in the global south know that they will use their multilingualism for horizontal purposes, but they also need to have access to using languages for specific purposes, like, for example, that which is required in university settings and for publications of research reports and so on. So we know that we use horizontal and vertical multilingualism. Sometimes it's parallel and separate, sometimes it's mixed. So we understand that we need to do this because of the remnants of colonial nation-state ideology and how this has been placed over existing horizontal systems of multilingualism in our settings. That is our reality. So we understand this in relation to educational theory that we have imported from northern contexts. Now, the educational theory imported from northern contexts includes models and pedagogies that don't fit the bilingual and multilingual education practices in Southern contexts. So we can't take one of those models which is used, say, in Canada or in certain settings in the United States, where the direct method is used for our settings in Southern post-colonial settings, because our contexts are so different. So existing Southern systems of horizontal multilingualism lie underneath all informal education that takes place outside of the schooling setting and in the informal economies of our countries. Bilingual and multilingual educational practices and repertoires are in fact in every classroom, because every child, every teacher brings them into the classroom, even when these are overlaid by vertical monolingual policies. I am not keeping track of the time. Can you tell me how much time I have left, please?
You have about 15 minutes to 20 minutes.
Have I? Thank you. That's wonderful.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. So now I come to something which is a matter of great joy to me and great pride as well. It relates to the term or the observation that multilingualism is the medium of education. This is an idea, this is an observation that a student, a third-year student from Sarawak brought to me a few years ago. Now, I've spent my whole adult working life studying multilingualism, studying multilingual education. And the observation that multilingualism is the medium of education is something that actually escaped me. I didn't think of it like this. But my third-year student of linguistics from Sarawak did. So I thought that this might be quite interesting to people, participants in this forum. So in 2015, she undertook a third-year linguistics, small, tiny research activity in Sarawak during one of her vacations. And in one classroom, she noted that the teacher uses Arabic, Bahasa Malaysia, and Bahasa Sarawak. By practicing multilingualism as the medium of instruction, the students will be able to understand and pay more attention in their learning lesson. In another classroom in a different part of Sarawak, she observed dual language, which is Bahasa Malaysia and Bahasa Iban, can be found in one of the rural area schools in Sarawak. Then she interviewed some participants. 3 participant interviews were from different ethno-linguistic communities, Iban, Malay, Melano. Respondents think that the usage of more than one language is one of the best ways to develop their students' language repertoire. All respondents stated that they enjoy being multilingual, and it somehow helps a lot in their career development. Being multilingual will ensure that the language proficiency among people in workplace, school, and among society. Now, as one Mayuki's observation included, the usage of more than one language in school and on the signboard in a public area in Sarawak has indicated that there is a usage of other language rather than only the national language, which will accommodate every speech community in Sarawak. So what she's saying is that there is de facto use of bilingual and multilingual signage and practices. She concluded her research report with the following recommendation. Multilingualism and cultural diversity in Sarawak should be maintained in order to preserve the identity of its people and their nation. Now, for me, the research report that this student from Sarawak produced is one of the most important pieces of writing about multilingual education that I have come across. She didn't know the fancy theory. She was simply observing what was happening, and she was speaking to people on the ground, listening to what they had to say. And I find that incredibly powerful. After 20 or more years of mother tongue-based multilingual education developments and debates, what more do we need to know for Africa and Asia Pacific to share and to use productively? Well, I think that what we have and we need to know more about is expertise in understanding multilingual education, how people actually communicate in their daily lives in contexts which are linguistically and culturally diverse. And here I refer back to my student, Isawan Mayuki, because she actually just simply went into different contexts and listened, opened her ears and observed what was happening. How languages change as one moves from one village or town to a next is really important to understand. How people manage these changes in order to communicate for practical purposes, why and how Indigenous languages continue to be so important for healthy, inclusive, and safe communities. We also need to know a little bit more about South-South collaboration and decolonial perspectives of linguistic diversity and diversity in literacy practices. And so rethinking literacy from a perspective of Southern multilingualisms and literacies brings us to thinking about the global shifts and turbulence resulting in the changes of North-South, South-South, and East-West patterns of communication, including our understanding of literacy and how these are changing. What do we need to learn about literacy? What do we bring together, and how do we bring together South and Northern experiences of literacies? Which research data do we know is reliable and valid for students in South Africa and in Asia? Where and how do we start? Well, from Southern perspectives, how First Nations peoples in Australia, India, and Canada relate to literacy are really important. Remembering the literacy practices of Africa from very long ago, decolonizing our minds in regard to literacy, biliteracy, triliteracy, key findings of longitudinal studies of literacy, biliteracy, and educational outcomes. Multilingualism in one place is not the same as in another. There are many different kinds of multilingualism. Multilingualisms are plural features of humanity and people who use their various multilingual repertoires in different ways for different purposes. So I'm going to move to remote central desert area of Australia. And just many of you will recognize the image on this slide as the image of this very important place for Anangu people in Australia, for Indigenous First Nations people who live in the vicinity of this area. So this is Uluru. It lies at the heart of the region. It's a site where the creation beings from knowledge or Anangu knowledge, Chukupa, interact. The markers of the stories and the ancestral beings are seen on the rock and in the surrounding environment. 3 communities that make up the community are interconnected through Chukupa, and Uluru is a powerful visual site that draws Anangu people together from across the region. Now I move to the work of an Indigenous woman, Katrina Chitai, who has lived on the Anangu Pitjantjatjara lands in the central desert region of Australia for most of her life. And she speaks of Chukupa Chuta, the 100 languages. She speaks of how knowledge is co-created and transmitted through intimate associations between people, the affiliations of people that are anchored in the knowledge that people have from the past and that they have in the present, and that they hope very much that future generations will take on in future times. And these are her words. Before the baby is born, she hears the mother's voice, and the relationship is the #1 language. The language and stories are carried inside. They are already there. If I see a person, I can see language in their Karunpa spirit. Where children are moving around and playing, they have language. Language is talking, singing, story wire, painting, hunting, inma, and dancing. Storytelling, it is all connected, chungu. I have a relationship with trees, country, land, and when I see something like a tree, my Kurumpa hears its language. The relationship is already there. Many languages make us rich and proud. And she, together with her sisters, Janet and Umachi, have elaborated this notion in a series of 3 works of philosophical art that they have developed and translated in oral and written texts. So they've co-constructed this knowledge, and they've co-constructed the relationship of language and art and knowledge, and in fact, literacy, and how literacy in Anangu ways is very different from literacy as we understand it in northern texts written on a piece of paper or in a book. This is another example of a text. To be able to read this text, one has to be able to read the art and read the stories behind the art, and to remember the history of the different peoples in the Central Desert area and what all of these symbols mean. So for many of us, looking at this piece of art, we will see something that is visually appealing, but it will be very difficult for us to understand what is happening unless we learn how to read this and how to read the histories and how things have changed from the past to the present. One of the things that often happens in texts about indigenous literacies and discussions of indigenous languages is that some scholars suggest that these are recollections of the past. They've got no relevance in the future. So just to decode this section of this artwork and this text, if you see these horseshoe shapes, these, for those familiar with Australian Indigenous communities, indicate that there are people sitting around down and they're having a conversation. And the different colors here show us that these are people from diverse languages and diverse communities sitting down having conversations and sharing their knowledge together. Now, years ago, one wouldn't have seen the different colors here. And this is showing us that the world is changing, the contexts are changing, and that it's important for us to sit down and share our knowledge together.
Excuse me, Dr. Kathleen.
Yep.
Yep, you have about 5 to 10 minutes left.
Sure.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, so does that take into account the opportunities for people to ask questions? Will there still be time for people to ask questions?
Yes, we will give some opportunity for them to ask questions after.
Okay, all right, then I'm nearly finished.
Thank you.
So in other words, what I'm suggesting is that there are many different ways that we know about in Southern contexts of understanding multilingualism, but also other many different ways of understanding literacy and what literacy means to people from different places. So if we are thinking about what literacy means to people and language learning means to people who are First Nations people in Northern Canada, it means going out to country to learn on country. One can't learn in a context that is decontextualized from the place. So people learning the Cree language need to be on country. They need to be learning from the elders. They need to be going through the process of collecting wild herbs as they're learning the language and they are immersed in the place where the language originates. This is very similar to how people in the central desert region of Australia feel that they need to be absolutely on land in order to learn language, to be able to pass on knowledge from one generation to the next. In another context in India, this is a mural in a museum in Bhopal, where artists together are co-creating a history that is important, and it's a history that can be read by people. It's a history that is a literary text in art. It is one that many of us who are unfamiliar with decoding this would not be able to read. But it is nevertheless an important aspect of transmitting knowledge, transmitting important aspects of humanity from one generation to the next. So what I'm suggesting is that even our understanding of literacy may need to slowly change. We may need to start thinking about literacy in different ways from the ways in which we have thought we need to understand literacy in books, on paper, and so on. So key findings from the African, Southeast Asian, and South Asian research from 1980 to 2021. Students in multilingual societies who attend formal education need a minimum of 6 years of learning to read and learning how to read for learning in the language of their local community, which is the home or the mother or the first language. And they also need 6 years of well-resourced teaching and learning of a second or third language, which is going to be something like English, French, or Portuguese, and opportunities to develop biliteracy through transfer of capabilities from the L1 to the L2 or L3, and also from the second or third language back to the first language. In other words, they need to develop their biliteracy in a two-way transfer, not a one-directional transfer. It's got to go back and forth before they can learn before they can learn through the second language effectively. There is no shortcut to this. There is no reliable evidence from anywhere in the world that shows that early transition from the L1 to an L2 by the second or third grade will show positive literacy achievement for students in low-income multilingual communities. Close scrutiny of the evaluations that make claims of long-term literacy achievement have been found to be unscientific, fundamentally flawed, and misleading. Instead, in Africa, South and Southeast Asia, we found and developed multilingual pedagogies that can be used in urban, rural, and remote communities that can make mother tongue multilingual education work well. They are ones developed by teachers in schools. They are ones being developed by teachers in Malaysia, in every Asian country, across the Asia Pacific, the Americas. And teachers even in Ireland have found these methodologies to be so productive that in a school with 80 different language communities, students in Ireland exit primary school with literacy in their home languages, Irish, Gaelic, French, and English. I think I'm just going to skip through this slide. So Africa and Asia have proud decolonial histories of literacy and mother tongue-based multilingual scholarship. It's these histories and scholarship that must guide our youth and future generations. We have our own research about how and why colonial, neocolonial, and post-colonial dependency on northern discourses reproduces policies that default to a single national language or EMI. And we have ones that deny the existence of or stigmatize the daily multilingual practices of multilingual education in Africa, Asia, and the Americas. We know that multilingualism and multilingual practices in one context, country, part of a country, is not the same as in another. Teachers in schools are best placed to understand the multilingual needs of their students. They will respond as best as possible when policies are flexible enough to accommodate responses that are appropriate for local communities. It may help if we open our ears. There's a phrase in a language called isiXhosa from Africa, which is vula intlebe, which means to hear, to listen, and to acknowledge that in reality, multilingualism is the lingua franca in Africa, and multilingualism is the medium of instruction in Sarawak and probably in most places. These are essential understandings for any education authority that cares for students from diverse backgrounds, both national minority communities and also migrant and refugee communities. If we are to travel towards a world in which core values of humanity are honored with care, hope, and love for peaceful futures, we can use what we know better by sharing our expertise. So, enkosi kakhulu, ngiyaleboha, merci, thank you, Talia.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Kathleen, for a thought-provoking and inspiring talk. Now we have a few questions, comments, and feedbacks from the chat box from the audience. So without further delay now, we shall now go through some of the questions, comments, and feedbacks from the audience. We have, let us just go through some of the questions. We have from this question, Dr. Kathleen.
Yes.
What approaches have been proven effective for managing the use of multilingual curriculum? Please.
Okay. The best approaches would be to use at least 2 languages in the classroom. And if the teacher can use the language, at least one language which is used by most children as the language that they know best, as well as the target language of the school, that is important. The second thing is, if the teacher doesn't know the languages of the children, there will always be at least one child in the class who can act as the mediator between the teacher and the other students in the classroom. So what we found very often is that there'll be 1 or 2 students who sometimes act as the interpreter between the teacher and the children. So if the children don't understand what the teacher's saying, there's somebody who can say, well, actually what the teacher means is this. So to have the flexibility to allow that is a really a very empowering pedagogy. A very practical pedagogy is that if one is using 2 languages and one feels that one needs to be taking the children on a journey towards, from the mother tongue towards the language of the school, is to introduce the lesson in the language that the children know best, to build on that lesson in the target language, and then to end the lesson by summarizing and making sure that the children are able to understand the lesson in the first language. What we also know with regard to this is that if we only use the home language or the mother language in the spoken text, and we don't make sure the children can read and write that language, then often they don't learn well enough. They need to see both languages written. So there needs to be posters in the classroom. There needs to be text on, I don't know whether what the resources look like in rural areas, but the rural areas I'm used to, there are still blackboards. So the teachers put things up on the blackboards or the whiteboards in 2 different languages, and the children see parallel text, 2 texts, but they're able to negotiate meaning using their mechanisms to move back and forth between languages. Does that work? Does that help?
All right. Thank you, Dr. Kathleen. Next, we have another request for comments. It says, as we know at the primary level, there is a tendency to develop English language education policies based on the policies of the earlier is better and more is better. What's your comment on this?
Okay, there is not a single reliable research activity that can demonstrate that that approach will last and that children will retain their literacy in English. So very often, a lot of these programs are evaluated over 1 or 2 years, and you have some very persuasive, attractive programs being introduced to countries. Often they're very expensive, and the agents that present these programs say, this is the very best one. We have got absolute evidence this one will work. Your kids at the end of the first year will be able to transition straight into English and they'll be absolutely fine. So they have these introductory programs. They work very well. They seem to work very well, but in actual fact, when you look at the students' achievement over the second, third, fourth year, you notice that the students' achievement starts to deteriorate very rapidly from the third or the fourth year onwards. And the kids then end up and don't have literacy which can be sustained or used for the rest of the schooling system. It doesn't work. It only works for middle-class children in professional homes in certain schooling contexts, but it does not work for the majority of children in global South countries.
Thank you, Dr. Kathleen. Next, we have another question, and that is, well, how do we reconcile the mother language education with national building?
Okay, I'll give you a very good example. I don't know if anybody knows about some of the terrible atrocities in Africa and Central Africa, in countries in Burundi and Rwanda, where people spoke the same language. Okay. And that did not stop the most terrible genocide. So it's not about the language. Often people find unity in being able to use their multilingualism. So for example, in Africa, the observation is that people find ways of getting by communicating in a multilingual way. It doesn't create division. What has created division is the gap between those very small minority of people who have access to English, French, or Portuguese to a very high level, and those who don't have access to that. So that exacerbates the political and socioeconomic divides, and that is extremely dangerous. So you can see that unraveling in South Africa at the moment, where the majority of people have been left very disadvantaged because they don't have access. They don't have meaningful access to English because they can't get there without going via their home language. So it doesn't make sense to many people, but there is no alternative.
Thank you.
I can see this question about it's politically unrealistic to expect a policy of 6 years in all countries of Southeast Asia. Okay, so if 2 to 3 years is not enough and 6 years is not possible, what can be done? So the thing about bilingual education is you use the two languages together. It's not one or the other. Okay, so all that is necessary is to keep the mother language or the local language in the classroom. One can still run the curriculum mainly through the target language. It's about gradually moving towards the target language, but you've got to retain a bilingual methodology all the way to the end, at least of the 6th year. But if it's not well resourced and the teachers don't know how to use the methodology well, unfortunately 6 years will not be enough and you'll probably need 8 years. So it's about teacher education. The teacher education doesn't cost any more than providing teacher education in English only. Probably the teacher education might be more successful if it were to match the languages that the teachers speak, in addition to realistic expectations of what the teachers are able to do in the classroom. So cost-wise, it's not actually that more expensive. We've done the costings. What we've also done the costings on are what happens if you don't do that? what is the cost? What is the medium to long-term cost for a country if you don't do that? The cost is enormous because it means that the majority of children will not be able to engage in the formal economy. They will have to stay outside of their formal economy. They will not end up paying taxes, which are then used to subsidize education. So one has to ask the right questions. What is the cost? What is the political cost? What is the economic cost of doing this? What is the cost of not doing it? What is the political cost and consequence of not actually ensuring that all students have a good chance of remaining in school to the end of secondary school and to have future prospects? Because the political cost might be conflict, disaffection further down the line, students falling into extremist organizations and so on.
Thank you, Dr. Kathleen. We missed a few questions here. How does learning mother tongue education help in the child's learning process, especially when the child uses mother tongue in communication in their family?
Sorry, I can't see the question. And
it's at 10:05.
Oh, okay, so 10:05. Okay, my time and your time are two different things is coming up here.
Okay, it's the question number 6.
Okay. Oh, okay. It's going to be too long for me to see when. It's question number 6. Can you just repeat the question for me then?
It says, how does learning mother tongue education help in the child's learning process, especially when the child uses mother tongue in communication in their family?
So if they're using mother tongue in their family, that's the ideal language to be used in the school for educational purposes, because they're building on what they already know and they can actually make sense of what they know. You can't actually learn to read unless you understand the words, the sentences, the language that you are reading. All that could possibly ever happen is that you learn how to decode and to sound out the words on a page, but you can read those words with no meaning whatsoever. You cannot learn anything unless you actually understand the language through which the learning needs to take place. But you can also be taken on a bilingual journey or a multilingual journey from the home language into the main language of the school, so that you can go on a bilingual journey to be learning the main language and also being able to see how you can move the knowledge that you have in your home language, what it looks like in the school language. So it's about language moving and knowledge moving that way, and then checking that it actually makes sense going back the other way. It's about a two-way process. I hope that helps a little bit.
Thank you. Certainly. Next, we have a question. Would the proficiency of the child in a specific language be affected if 2 languages are used to teach one subject? The translation method in brackets.
There is a great deal of value in translation. And although much of the new publications and research reports talk about the process of translanguaging, essentially this is very much an aspect of translation. Translating knowledge from one language, translating what is in one language to the other, helps the learning process, because the child starts to develop 2 ways of understanding the same concept or the same piece of knowledge that needs to be learned. So it's a really effective, useful way of learning and strengthens the cognitive development of the child. So it does many things. It helps knowledge transfer, and it also helps to advance the proficiency in 2 languages at the same time.
Thank you. Excellent. The next question is it fair to postulate that translanguaging and transknowledging, the seemingly current bedrocks of multilingualism, concerns language and knowledge transfer?
Well, you see, the thing about multilingual education is what do we mean? What is education? What is the purpose of education? The purpose for education, the way I understand it, is that we work with children in school in order to ensure that they receive the kind of education that is going to help them to live more useful, productive, safe lives in future, that will allow them to get jobs and so on. So that requires knowledge, various kinds of knowledge. So multilingual education is to use language in order to get knowledge. And one can't get knowledge unless one has language. So a colleague of mine, Eckhard Wolff, once said, language is not everything in education, but without language, everything in education is nothing. So what does he mean by everything in education? That is knowledge. You can't get to the knowledge without language. So what is happening for most children of the world, the majority of children in the world, is that whether they are actually in schools which are labeled bilingual or multilingual, they are in bilingual or multilingual learning environments. They come from certain languages, sometimes many languages, and they face education in another language. So they are involved in bilingual, multilingual education. And what happens for most is that we pretend it's not there. But inside the head, the child is grappling with trying to make sense of knowledge in one language and for it to come out in another language. And it's too much for the child to do without us actually helping the child and saying, let's be more explicit about this. We know that's going on in the mind. Let us work with useful ways of doing this, practical ways of doing this in the classroom.
Thank you very much. And the next question says, or comments, if minority language groups feel their language and culture are valued by the nation, they will likely feel more loyal to the nation than in opposition to it. Would you agree?
Yes. I mean, in many parts of the world, people are realizing that you need to work with the minority languages. And if you don't include the minority languages, people feel alienated. They feel that they do not belong. What one wants in a safe, secure country, nation, is to make sure that all people feel that they belong. And one way to make people feel belong is through acknowledging their languages. So that slide that I showed you with Katrina Chitai talking about language, she's indicating that language is so important. It's about one's identity, that if you strip the language away, then everything goes. You are left as if you are not there. You are left as if you are invisible. So it is really important for national security and for unity.
Okay, thank you. The next question is, shouldn't we continue to use multilingualism or translanguaging throughout a child's educational development from primary to tertiary education?
This is my belief. This is actually my belief. This is also something that I have found. I use bilingual and multilingual pedagogies in my teaching at university. I've used it in undergraduate programs, I use it in postgraduate programs, and I use it with my PhD students. They learn so much and they're able to do so much if they're able to look at things from different language perspectives. Because when we look at something through the lens of one language, we see something. If we can look at it through another language, we can see something else. And you put those two together, you see a great deal more. But I have found that with the international students that we are fortunate to have at the University of South Australia, that they really enjoy the opportunity to be able to bring information to the classroom, to every course that I teach, from their own language background. And they like to be able to demonstrate to the English-speaking Australian students that they know how to bring language from another language or other languages into the classroom. And it puts the English-speaking students who don't have bilingual and multilingual capabilities, it puts them in a situation where they suddenly realize that they don't know everything, that they don't have access, and they are reliant on the international students who have much broader worldviews and that know much more. So it's really important for on so many levels.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Next, we have a little bit more time for a few more questions, 1 or 2 questions. It says here, what do you suggest, or I think what do you think when mother tongue is only oral and not written?
Yeah, okay, so we've got years and years and years of research on this from sub-Saharan Africa, where it is just spoken, whether the mother tongue is just spoken, the children just don't get it. They've got to see it written. They've got to see it in forms of text. They've got to see that the language is there. Because if you only speak the language and you never teach the reading and writing in the language, they can't make that transition to, they can't trans-language into English or French or Portuguese. It's absolutely crucial to make both languages visible as much as possible on every single task that the students do. To ask them, can you label this diagram in 2 languages? Can you explain this process in 2 languages? Does your father know a language that your mother doesn't know? Can you bring some of that information into the classroom? Well, how many languages, how many names for this particular thing have you got in your home or in your community? So the more languages you bring in, the more windows open for the child, and the more the learning becomes meaningful. It adds layers and layers of meaning for the child.
Thank you, Dr. Kathleen. Next, we have this question. What does research say about using English, like in Malaysia, to teach only some subjects, such as maths and science, whereas other subjects use Bahasa Malaysia?
All right, so what I can tell you is that in the European Union, the children of the European Parliament officials go to something called European schools. And in those schools, the children follow their national curriculum for primary school. And then when they go to secondary school, they learn they have to have their home language, their first additional language, and then a third language. So maths and science are always taught in the home language. History and geography in secondary school in the European Union, the schools for the European parliamentarians and officials, history and geography are taught in their second language. So the kids develop bilingualism very well, but maths and science is always taught in the home language. Why? Because the information is decontextualized. Now that is not realistic in the Asia Pacific, where 55% of the world's languages are, because we probably cannot teach maths and science only in the 55% of the languages. I can't remember, what is it? It's about 3,500, 4,000 languages, right? We just can't do that. What we can do, though, is we can teach bilingually. We can teach maths and science through English, but we can also find ways to ensure that the students we can translate, we can trans-language questions, the way we pose questions and explain concepts and so on. So we can actually do this bilingually, and it doesn't require full bilingual treatment, if that is the question.
Thank you. I think we have time just for one final question or comment, I suppose. It says here, my comment, in brackets, from an Australian viewpoint. I am a strong believer that English language teacher, or any teacher, training with a monolingual or just European language background should be learning or study at least one other non-European community language throughout their program. Ideally subject specific, but would tertiary institutions be ready, equipped for such an expansion? Also, your study that gives insight into the time that is needed to provide sustainable literacy will also be something Aboriginal language programs should be looking at.
I 100% agree with you. What I would very much like is for you to come and give that suggestion to my institution and every university in Australia. That is precisely what needs to happen. Yeah. There is another aspect. It is probably, for many people, very difficult to learn a non-European language in an Australian context, but every single teacher, whether they are bilingual or multilingual, needs to understand how to work bilingually and multilingually with students in their classrooms, because it doesn't matter which country we're in, there will be children in our classrooms who are bilingual and multilingual. How do we work with these children? We can no longer just use monolingual pedagogies. We have to use bilingual and multilingual pedagogies. So I mentioned on one of my slides a really excellent book that has been written by David Little and Deirdre Kirwan in relation to a school in Dublin, just outside of Dublin. And what has happened is Deirdre Kirwan was the school principal there, and within a very short period of time, the school changed from being Irish, English-speaking children only to having children from 80 different language backgrounds. So she just said to the teachers, you have to sort it out. You have to turn your classrooms into multilingual classrooms. We cannot just teach the children in English in the school any longer. And the teachers did it. They found ways to do that. And the only ways they could do that was to work with the children and the parents to bring those languages into the classroom. So there are ways we can get around this, but it would be wonderful if every teacher, every English-speaking teacher was also bilingual.
Thank you, Dr. Kathleen. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for your questions. Thank you for your comments. I think it is about time that we end this session. Thank you very much. But before we do that, we will now invite Dr. Kathleen for your concluding remarks. Dr. Kathleen?
I must have some concluding remarks. I didn't realize that. Well, what I would like to say is thank you so much for inviting me. Thank you for the wonderful questions that are here. I'm very happy for people to contact me afterwards, and I'm very happy to circulate my slides to anybody who's interested. So I will certainly send the revised version through for circulation if that would be helpful. But the one thing that I think is, whatever you can do, whoever is participating in this, please put the message out that truncating children's opportunities to use their home languages is the worst possible thing we can be doing, and probably the most unethical thing we can do to children if we really want to change the world and to give all children an equal opportunities to succeed in life. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you again, Dr. Kathleen. And with that, we have come to the end of this session. Our utmost thanks to Dr. Kathleen Heugh, Jutaan terima kasih, and that is in Malay, and to everyone who are with us in this keynote address. Terima kasih, and now we will hand over to the program back to the MC Kaya. Thank you.
All right. Terima kasih. Thank you. 谢谢. Thank you very much to Dr. Heugh for your wonderful presentation and the insightful sharing. I personally love the message that a new language opens up a new window for the children. Not only for children, I believe for adults as well. Thank you so much, Dr. Heugh. And thank you to Mr. Amin Megat for your excellent job moderating the session. Thank you so much. Thank you. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, we have an announcement from the organizer. When the conference ends, upon the approval and permission of the speakers or the panelists, The organizer will upload the relevant slideshow or papers to the official website of the conference. You can see the link of the website at the chat box of this Zoom. So we will have a break now and we will come back at 11 a.m. sharp. To give a short tease, the first panel session aims to discuss past and emerging language in education issues related to mother tongue education in Malaysia. See you at 11 later. See you and bye.